Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video, we're going to talk about how to create and use custom assemblies in SQL Server reporting services. We'll begin the video with a quick explanation of what a custom assembly actually is and why you might want to use one in the first place. Then we'll explain how you can begin creating a class library project in Microsoft Visual Studio. We'll include a little section there that explains how to get hold of a free version of Visual Studio if you don't currently have one. When we're writing our custom functions, we'll explain how you can do that in both Visual Basic and in Visual C#, so you'll get a flavour of both programming languages. And then we'll explain how you can take the custom functions you've written and build them into a DLL, or a dynamic linked library. Once you've done that, we'll explain how you can make those DLLs available to reports that you're writing in SQL Server Data Tools, and how you can use your custom functions in expressions in those reports. The last part of the video is going to explain how to create something called a post-build event, just in case you want to make changes to your DLLs at a later stage. This makes it much easier to redeploy the DLLs and copy them to the correct locations. So there's quite a lot to do in this video. Let's get started. In the previous video in this series, we looked at the idea of adding code to a report to enable you to write your own custom functions. And the idea behind doing this was to save you time writing out long, complex expressions again and again and again. So once you've written a custom function in the code page of the Report Properties dialog box, you can then call that function from various other parts of your report. So I've used it in several text boxes here to generate a nice long date format, but without having to write out that same long, complex expression multiple times. Now, although you can write code in a single report and it works reasonably well, the downside is, of course, that the code is only available to that single report. We mentioned in the previous video that it's possible to create report templates and store code in there, but it still means that the code is quite difficult to maintain. So in this video, we're going to explain how to create your own custom function library by creating something called a custom assembly and then deploying that so that it's available to every new report project that you create. To start creating a custom assembly, we need to begin a new class library project in Microsoft Visual Studio. Now, if you don't currently have a copy of Visual Studio, you can download Visual Studio Express for free from the Microsoft website. So a quick Google search for Visual Studio Express will turn up this link, and following it will take you to the Visual Studio Express page. Currently, the latest version available for download is Visual Studio 2013, and probably the best version to go with for what we're about to do is Express 2013 for Windows Desktop, which comes along with a variety of programming languages including C#, Visual Basic and C++. Now, you may remember from the previous video, we mentioned that you could only write embedded code in Microsoft Visual Basic. But when you're creating a custom assembly, you can use any of the .NET languages, so Visual Basic, C#, C++, or even another one. For this video, we're going to stick to showing you examples in Visual Basic and C#. So this is probably the best version to go for what we're about to do. Now, if you prefer an older version of Visual Studio, you should still be able to, or currently you can still get access to the Visual Studio 2010 edition. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can click the link for Visual Studio 2010 Express products. Now, unlike the 2013 ones, which come along with a variety of languages in one instance, with Visual Studio 2010 you have to choose which language you want to use. And of course, there's nothing to stop you from downloading each of the individual versions themselves. You could have all three or more. But to begin with, make sure you choose which language it is you want to go for. As I mentioned before, we're going to stick with Visual Basic and C# in this particular video. So, once you've downloaded and installed Visual Studio, you'll then be able to open up a new instance of it, which I'm going to do with a quick double click of a desktop shortcut. And when it's opened up, finally, we can then begin creating our class library project. So to create my class library project, I can head to the File menu, choose New, Project, and then use the dialog box to select the type of project I want to create. Now, as I said, we're going to create projects for both Visual Basic and Visual C#. I'm going to head to the Visual Basic category of templates on the left-hand side first, and I'm going to choose the Class Library template. Before I create this, I need to make sure that I'm using the correct .NET Framework version. Now, Microsoft say you can't use the .NET Framework 4. Currently, Reporting Services doesn't support class libraries built in .NET Framework 4, so I need to revert to a previous version of this. I'm going to go back to 3.5. So I've got the class library selected, correct .NET Framework. I'll give the class library a sensible name. I'm going to call mine Custom Functions VB. and I'm going to make sure this gets created on my desktop. Just realised I've misspelled custom functions, there we go. And then if I click the OK button, that will create my Visual Basic project. I'll end up with looking at a single class code page where I can start writing out my code, and there it is. Now I could do exactly the same thing to create my C# version. I could create or open up another instance of Visual Studio and create an independent C# version of a class library. But for convenience in this video, I'd like both my Visual Basic and C# libraries to be in the same solution. So what I can do here is I can head to the Solution Explorer, right click on the solution at the top of the list. If you can't see this, by the way, you may well need to head to the Tools menu and choose Options, and on the Options dialog box when it appears, head to the Projects and Solutions node and then check the box for Always Show Solution. Once you can see that, you can right click on the solution and you can choose Add New Project. So this time I'm going to go to the C# category and I'm going to look for the class library, and I'm going to call this one Custom Functions CS, short for C# of course. So if I click OK, I'll end up with another project in exactly the same solution using a different programming language. I can switch between the two classes that I've created simply by clicking on the different tabs. And as I say, this is purely for convenience. There's no real advantage to having these in the same solution. It's just for me to be able to switch between them quickly. On that note, it would have actually been possible to avoid opening up a new instance of Visual Studio altogether. If I head back to my movie project in Reporting Services, SQL Server Data Tools, this is just a special instance of Visual Studio. So in the Solution Explorer here, I could have happily right-clicked on my solution and chosen to add a new project, and I could have chosen the Visual C# class library or a Visual Basic class library, and it would have worked in exactly the same way. That would have made a little bit of a mess of my Solution Explorer in my Report Server project, however, so I'm thinking I'm quite happy that I've got this separate solution containing my VB and C# class libraries. Let's start by renaming the classes that we've created in our class library projects. Now in the real world, when you're creating a complete library of functions, you might have lots and lots of different classes, each containing several different functions. So they're purely an organisational thing. You could write all of your functions in a single class if you wanted to. For our example, we're going to write at least one function to do with dates. So I'm going to right click on class1.vb and I'm going to choose to rename it. And making sure I don't change the extension, I'm going to call this date functions. When I do that and hit enter, it's going to ask me if I want to update all of the references to that class, and that's a good sensible idea. So let's click the yes button to make sure that that happens as well. You can see that the date, what was previously class1.vb has now changed to datefunctions.vb. I can do exactly the same thing for my C# class as well. So back in the Solution Explorer, I can right click class1 and I can choose rename. Make sure I don't change the .cs extension, and I'm going to call this one date functions as well. Again, I'm going to be asked if I want to change or update all the references, and again, that's a good idea. So I'm going to click yes, and there we go, there's the two classes renamed. Later on in the development of my library of functions, I may well want to add more classes, and adding a class to a project is relatively straightforward. Find the name of the project you want to add the class to, right-click on it, and then choose to Add, and there'll be a dedicated option to insert a class. When the dialog box appears, I'll have to give my class a sensible name. So I'm going to call this one, let's say, text functions, which I might write later on. And then if I click the add button, that class will be added to the project. Now, we may well come back and do this later on, but for the moment I'm actually going to close down my text functions class. And in the Solution Explorer, I'm going to delete it as well. I'm going to right click on the class and choose to delete it. Confirm that I definitely want to do that, just to keep things simple and tidy for the moment. The function example that we're going to write is going to return a nicely formatted version of a date that we pass into the function. So just to show you quickly what the date will look like, it's going to look something similar to this. So it'll have a full name of the day of the week, then it'll have the number of the day of the month, including the correct suffix as well, so ST, ND, RD or TH, then the full name of the month and the 4-digit year. So to get started with writing a function that will do that, let's head back to our class library. I might as well start with the C# version, as that's one that I'm looking at the moment. I've got my public class date functions. It's important that the class is public, by the way, in order to be able to reference this later on. So somewhere within this pair of braces, I need to write out my list of functions. And the first one I'm going to declare is going to be another public function. I'm also going to make it static as well. For performance reasons, Microsoft recommend using static members of a class when you're writing custom assemblies. So I'm going to call mine public static. Then I'm going to say what data type my function will return, and that's going to be a string. And then I can finally say what my function is going to be called, and I'm going to call mine long date format. For this function to work, I'm going to pass in a single argument to a single parameter, so I'm going to open a set of parentheses at that point. The data type of the parameter is going to be a date time, and the name of the parameter, I'm just going to call it anyDate, with a capital D actually. Close round brackets, and then hit enter. And in C#, you need to wrap up all the code for a method in a pair of braces. I will get a squiggly red underline at the moment, indicating there's some kind of error, and the error is that I haven't actually returned any value yet. Well, that's simply because we haven't written the code yet. So we'll carry on writing the code, and we'll actually see this be resolved automatically as we proceed. Probably the most awkward part of this function is calculating which suffix to add to the end of the day of the month. To do that, I'm going to use a variable which I'm going to use to hold the suffix and then concatenate that into the final string before we return the result. So I'm going to declare a string variable which I'm going to call suffix, and then I'm going to use a switch statement to calculate what suffix should be added. So I begin a switch statement by writing the word switch, and then in a set of parentheses I write out the expression that I'm testing for each different case. So for this example, I'm going to use the day property of my date time parameter. So the day property returns the day of the month. If I then open and close a set of braces, and inside the switch statement I can then start adding my various cases. So let's calculate the ST. If it's the 1st, 21st or 31st of the month, I want the letters ST stored in the suffix variable. So I need to write 3 separate cases. I'm going to say case 1, colon, case 21, colon, case 31, colon. And if that's true, I'm going to say that suffix should be made to be equal to the letters ST, and then I can say break. In fact, I have to say break to tell the switch statement to move to the next case, or in fact, to avoid evaluating any future cases. So there's the first case, or first 3 cases, I suppose, dealt with. I can then repeat that sort of pattern. I can say case 2, case 22. If that's true, if either of those are true, I can say suffix equals ND, and then again break to avoid evaluating any further conditions. Scroll down a little bit so you can see what's going on. Case 3, case 23, suffix equals RD, break, and then finally the default case for my switch statement. If none of those conditions happen to be true, then I'm going to use the default case and say that the suffix should be equal to TH. And once again, break at the end. So there's the switch statement created. Oops, I've forgotten my semicolon at the end of my my statement. There we go. That's why that didn't indent properly. That's better. So there's the switch statement created. The final set of things to do now is concatenate the correct suffix into the final string. To return a value from a C# function, I need to say return, and then write out the expression that I want to return as the answer. So let's concatenate together the 3 different parts. I'm going to refer to my anyDate parameter, and then I'm going to apply the toString method to that. The toString method has an optional parameter that allows me to specify what format I want to use. So it's the 3rd overload of the toString method. The format I want to use to begin with is in a set of double quotes, 4 Ds, followed by a space, and then another D. So if, for example, the day was Monday the 1st of October, this expression would give me Monday 1. What I need to do to the end of that is concatenate the value of the suffix variable. So I can say plus suffix, then another plus, and then anyDate dot toString, and then format the rest of the date. So I'm going to open some more double quotes. I'm going to give myself a space, and then type in 4 capital M's, followed by another space, and 4 Y's. Close the double quotes, close the parentheses, and don't forget the semicolon. And that's the C# version of the function completely written. So we've got the variable to hold the suffix, used a switch statement to calculate the value of the suffix variable, and then concatenated everything together and returned the result. What we should see now is that the squiggly red underline underneath long date format has now disappeared because my function is actually returning a value on all of the code paths. So that's the C# version written. Writing out the Visual Basic version of the function isn't too much different from C#. What I'm going to do first is save my C# class, and then switch over to the Visual Basic version and start declaring my function in Visual Basic. Now, Visual Basic syntax is somewhat different to C# syntax, but in declaring a function, many of the elements are still the same. Although some of the words are different and the order is different, the main elements still apply. So it's going to be a public shared function, which I'm going to call long date format. So it's going to have the same name as my C# version. I can open some parentheses and declare the parameters of my function, just like in C#, although again the syntax of declaring parameters is somewhat different. You start with the name of the parameter, which I'm going to call anyDate, and then say what data type it has. So in this case it's going to be asDate. What I can then do is close the parentheses and say what kind of data this function returns. So it's going to be asString. If I hit enter, I'll get the words end function added, and again it indicates to me in some way that the function doesn't yet return a value. So it's slightly different again to the way C# does it, but it still tells me that that's the case. Following the same logic as the C# function, we're going to declare a variable which will hold the suffix we're going to use. So to declare variables in VB, you start with the word dim, which is short for dimension, followed by the name of the variable, followed by the data type you'd like it to have, so dim suffix as string. Then we're going to use the equivalent of the switch statement in C#, which in Visual Basic is called select case. So I say select case, and then I can say what particular expression I'm evaluating. So again, for me, it's going to be anyDate dot day. The end select statement gets added for me automatically, which is always quite nice. And I have to remember to close my braces. What I can then do is write out the various cases I'm trying to test for. If I say case 1, 21, 31, and then on the next line I can say suffix equals st. So although the syntax is almost completely different, the actual logic of what we're doing is exactly the same. If I write another case and I can say 2, 22, then I can say suffix equals nd, case 3, 23, suffix equals rd, and finally I can say case else suffix equals th. Again, the last step is to tell the function to return a value, and that's very similar to the C# syntax. I say return, followed by concatenating the various elements of the date format. So I'm going to say anyDate dot toString, so the same method applies, and it's got a similar argument that I can use to provide the format string. So I'm going to say in this case again 4 Ds followed by a single D, then concatenate that. The concatenation symbol in VB is the ampersand rather than a plus symbol as in C#, and then I can say suffix, and I can say another ampersand, and I can say anyDate dot toString, and provide the final element of the format string, which is going to be another space, 4 capital M's, and then 4 Y's. Close double quotes and close round brackets, and then again my little warning about my function not returning a value has disappeared, so my function now does return a value. So I can save that class, and our two functions have been written. Now in the real world, it's very likely that you'll be writing many more functions in your class, or even creating more classes and writing functions in those. But to keep things simple for this video, we're going to stick with a single function that we've written in each of the different languages. What we're going to do next is build our projects to generate a DLL, or a dynamic linked library, which we can then reference in our report server project. So I'm going to start by closing down my two classes that I've been writing my code in, and then head back to the Solution Explorer, where I can go to build my projects. To do that, I simply have to right-click on a project name and choose to build it. And I should get a little output window telling me whether or not my build is going to succeed or not. So that's worked for my Visual Basic project. I need to do exactly the same thing for my C# project, and of course in the real world you'd only need to do this once. You'd only be hopefully programming in one single language unless you were trying to show off, I suppose. So I can right click on my C# project and choose to build that as well. My output window should tell me that that succeeded as well. Excellent. So we've built our DLLs. What we now need to do is be able to reference those in our report server project, and that involves a little bit of copying our DLLs to the correct location first. Knowing that we need to copy our DLL to a different location kind of raises the question of where our DLL is stored in the first place. One way to find out is to use the properties of one of your projects. So if I head back to the Solution Explorer, I can right-click on my VB project, for instance, and choose to view its properties. On the dialog box that appears, I can head to the Compile tab, and there's a property here that tells me the output path of any built projects. So it's in the bin debug folder of my project root. If I'm doing this in C#, the tab is slightly different, almost as you'd expect by now, I suppose. So in the Solution Explorer, if I right-click my C# project and choose Properties, it's a similar dialog box, it's just that the tab is called Build rather than Compile. But it has a property on here called the output path, and that's exactly where my DLL will be stored. So one way to get to that is to open up a Windows Explorer window and navigate there yourself, or we can take a quick shortcut actually. If I head to the Solution Explorer, I can right-click on one of my projects and choose to open its folder in the Windows Explorer. So if I do that, I'll go almost directly to the correct place. If you remember, we had the bin folder and then the debug folder. So if I double-click into there and double-click into the debug folder, I can find my DLL file, which I can then right-click on and choose to copy. The next step is to find which folder I need to copy this DLL into. Now there are two separate locations for where you can copy your DLL. One is for debugging and testing your reports in the report designer, and the other is for when your reports have been deployed to the report server. So let's go to the report designers folder first of all. If I head to my operating system C drive, what I'm looking for in here is the program files folder. So if I open up the Program Files folder, which is the default location for Visual Studio to be installed, we then need to find the correct version of Visual Studio. So if I'm coding in Visual Studio 2010, which is what SQL Server Data Tools runs in, the folder for that is Microsoft Visual Studio 10. The other two folders that I have here, version 9 is for Visual Studio 2008. So if you're still running in Visual Studio or Reporting Services 2008 Release 2, you'll need to copy your DLL into the Visual Studio 9 folder. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio 10, and then in there, I'm looking for the folder called Common 7. In there, the IDE folder. Then in there, the Private Assemblies folder. And then this is where I can paste in my DLL. So if I right click somewhere in here, and I can choose just to simply paste that file. While I'm here, I'm actually going to quickly switch back to my my custom functions solution, and I'm going to quickly find my C# version. I'm going to right click on the C# project and choose to open its folder in Windows Explorer. And then just as I did with the VB version, I can double click the bin folder and the debug folder and copy my C# DLL. And then with my previous Windows Explorer window, I can head back to that folder, the Private Assemblies folder, and then I can just paste in my custom functions DLL in there as well. So that makes my functions available to the report designer for debugging purposes. When I deploy my reports, though, they won't currently be able to use those DLLs. So I need to copy these both to another location. I'm going to select them both and copy them both to avoid having to go backwards and forwards. And then, to show you the default path, if I head back to my C drive, and again find Program Files, and then the default location for this is the folder called Microsoft SQL Server. Now I've got a slightly unusual arrangement of SQL Server installed on my current machine. I've got multiple different versions installed, and I've actually installed those to different named folders. So actually, rather than Microsoft SQL Server, I need to go into the Microsoft SQL Server 2012 folder instead. What I'm looking for in here is the MSRS folder. So because I'm working in SQL Server 2012, it's MSRS 11. If you're working in SQL Server 2008 Release 2, that will be MSRS 10. If I double click into that folder and then find the Reporting Services folder in there, and then find the Report Server folder in there, I can then find the bin folder, and finally I can paste in the DLL files. You'll see a load of other DLLs already in there as well. So I just right click in there and choose to paste my DLLs, and there they are. What I need to do now is test if my custom assemblies work. So I'm going to head back to my Movies Report Server project and close down the report that I'm currently working on and choose to create a brand new blank report. So Solution Explorer, right click Reports, Add New Item. I'm going to choose a basic blank report template, which I'm going to call number 57, Custom Assemblies. And then I'm going to add that to my project. Before I can use the functions in either of my custom assemblies, I have to set a reference to them both. So to do that, I can right-click in the background of the report and choose Report Properties, and on the dialog box, head to the References tab. I'm going to add an assembly by clicking the Add button, and then click the ellipsis button to browse for where my assembly is stored. By default, I'll pop up and display the .NET assemblies eventually. I seem to have stopped responding. There we go, eventually, there we go. And then I can head to the Browse tab to browse for my particular custom assembly. So I know that I stored mine in C, Program Files, Microsoft Visual Studio 10, Common 7, IDE, Private Assemblies, and then somewhere in here are my custom functions. So I'll go for the C# one first of all, and click OK. Then I can add another reference and click the ellipsis button again. Wait for an interminable length of time. There we go. There's a browse button again. Sadly, I've got to go through the whole process again. So it's C, it's good practice, I suppose. C, Program Files, Microsoft Visual Studio 10, Common 7, IDE, Private Assemblies, Custom Functions VB, and click OK, and then click OK again. So that's the difficult part done. What I can now do is use those functions in those libraries in expressions in my report. Let's test our functions using a nice simple text box. If I right-click into the report, I can choose to insert a text box, and I can right-click into the text box and choose Expression. What I then need to do is write out a fully qualified reference to my long date format function. So what I need to start with is the name of the project, then the name of the class, followed by the name of the function, and pass in any arguments to any of its parameters. So this is where you definitely need to remember what you've called things. You don't get any help here whatsoever. There's no IntelliSense to help you out. So if I quickly switch back to my class library project and open up my Solution Explorer, I can see that my VB project is called Custom Functions VB, and I've got a class in there called Date Functions, and in there I've got a function called Long Date Format. My C# project is almost exactly the same. It's Custom Functions CS. Oh, actually, it's Custom Function CS. I've just noticed I've misspelled that one. That should be Custom Functions. I was trying to make it as consistent as possible, but I failed miserably there. So Custom Function CS. I'm glad I came back to check now. Date Functions. And in there, I've got another function called Long Date Format. So knowing that, let's head back to the Movies project. And I've got my expression builder open. So I've just found out that I've got a project called Custom Functions VB dot date functions, which is the name of the class, dot long date format, which is the name of the function, and I know I need to pass in a single value to one of its parameters. So it's got a single parameter to provide an argument to. So I'm going to use a built-in field to do that for convenience. I'm going to use the execution time to provide the current date and time, close a parentheses, then I'm just going to copy that expression, click OK, insert another text box, and right-click into there and choose expression, paste in the one that I've just copied, and then change the name. Very carefully here, I've got to make sure it's Custom Function CS, not functions, as it really should be. So if I click OK, and then just resize the text boxes ever so slightly, preview the report, and hopefully what we'll see are two beautifully formatted dates using our custom assembly. We should also make sure that our functions work when we deploy them to the report server. So I'm going to close down the report and then head back to the Solution Explorer. Now I've already deployed the entire project previously, so what I'm going to do is just right-click this single report and choose to deploy just it. And that should happen fairly quickly. There it is. And then if I switch to my report server or report manager application in running in Internet Explorer, I'll need to refresh the report manager to make sure that it shows me all the recently deployed items. If I head into my Movies project and then scroll down to find report number 57, Custom Assemblies, I should be able to load this one. And what I'm looking for here is when the report loads, is that it should show me the nicely formatted versions of my dates again. If it doesn't, we're in a bit of trouble. But there we go. So having copied the DLLs to the correct location, I knew that was going to happen. Having copied the DLLs to the correct locations, that means that the functions are available to both the report designer for debugging purposes and to the report server once your reports have been deployed. The last thing I'd like to talk about in this video is what happens if you want to make changes to your custom assemblies. writing more code and adding more classes to a project isn't that difficult. What is awkward is having to copy the recompiled or rebuilt DLLs to the correct locations again. So to avoid having to do that time and time again, what we can do is assign something called a post-build event. So that's something that will trigger automatically immediately after you've successfully built a project. So to do that for a Visual Basic project, what we can do is right-click on the project and choose to view its properties. And in the dialog box, we need to head onto the Compile tab and find the Build Events button somewhere towards the bottom right-hand corner. If I just quickly show you where to go to do that for the C# project, I'll just do this for one project just for convenience. For C#, the location is ever so slightly different. If I right-click my C# project, then choose Properties, I need to go to the Build Events tab, so it's a separate tab altogether, but essentially that replicates the dialog box that we've just seen. So I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic version just very quickly, right-click Properties, and on the Compile tab, Build Events, and I can start building my post-build events. I can do that by clicking the Edit Post Build button, just to avoid having to write out the whole thing from scratch myself. And it just gives me a little bit more power. I can use something called macros to insert relevant, useful bits of information. All I need to do now is write out the commands that I want to happen when my project has been successfully built. So to do that, I want to copy a file. I'm going to add /y to make sure that the original DLLs will be overwritten. And then I need to provide a source and a destination for the files being copied and essentially pasted. So the file that I'm copying is in the target path of my built project. So rather than typing out the full file and folder path, what I can do is open some double quotes and double click this target path macro and then close the double quotes, and that will automatically point to wherever my DLL has been built to. I'll enter a space then and open some more double quotes. And then, just to cheat, to avoid writing everything out from scratch, what I'm going to do is go back to a previous Windows Explorer window that I've kept open deliberately. So currently I'm looking at the file path for the report server. If I click into the address bar, I can then just copy that path, head back to my custom functions project, paste the path in, and then close some double quotes. I'm going to hit enter to go into the next line. I'm going to say copy /y, open some double quotes, double click target path, close some double quotes, space, open some more double quotes. Then I'm going to quickly find the other folder. If I switch back to program files, and then it's Visual Studio 10, Common 7, IDE, Private Assemblies. And if I copy this path, head back, paste the path in, and close the double quotes, and then finally click OK. So that ensures that when I successfully build, and that's the option I've got selected here, when I successfully build the project, it will copy the DLLs to the correct location. So let's make a quick change to my VB project. Let's right click and choose to add a new class, and I'm going to call this class text functions. I'm not going to write anything particularly complicated in here. This is purely for testing purposes. And in there I'm going to write public, oh dear, that wasn't very successful, public shared function. I'm going to call it company name. And it's not going to have any parameters at all, and it's going to simply return a string. And the string that the function is going to return is the name of Wise Owl Training. So I'm going to say return Wise Owl Training. So I've got a very, very elaborate way to enter that simple string of text. What I can do now is save that class and then close it down, head back to the Solution Explorer, and I'm going to right click on my VB project and I'm going to choose to build it. And what I should see in the output window, as well as the or the success of my project being built, it should also tell me that the file has been copied twice. So in order to test that that's worked, I can simply head back to my Movies project. I'm going to reopen my Custom Assemblies report. I'm going to insert another simple text box and another expression in there, and I'm going to say equals custom functions VB dot text functions dot company name, and I can optionally open and close the parentheses. I'll do it because it's good practice. Click OK, and then preview the report, and I ought to find that I've got another function available for use without having to do that laborious manually copy and paste my DLLs to the correct location. So that sort of ends the video on writing and creating custom assemblies in reporting services. Hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching.
If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.